Welcome everyone to yet another installment in our Fall Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza series. Today we're going to be talking about The Legend of Zelda, and as I like to do in these intros, if there is much, obviously I couldn't do much for the the Sonic episode. We do have plenty of news we can go through. That's kind of the point of these intros here, is of course not only to, introduce the episode, but to go over some topics that have potential, or some news that has come out about the series, whether it's just fun little things or actual big announcements between my original recording of the episode back earlier this summer, or and now that I am doing the intro. Of course, as you can tell, I still have my Rextro shirt on. If you're watching the video, audio listeners don't get to quite see that, kind of like how they didn't get to see the little studio tour from before in the last episode. I always recommend, maybe if you want to dabble in a little bit of both versions, you get to see some fun things in the video, or maybe you just enjoy audio. There's always perks to both, but I slightly digress there. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about The Legend of Zelda. So I just wanted to bring you some fun little stories courtesy of good old NintendoLife.com, since we're talking about a Nintendo-related topic here. I thought I would pull up some articles that might be fun that contribute to some of the topics that we're talking about in this episode. So perhaps the most recent piece, and talking about one of the most famous games of all time, widely considered by many to be the greatest video game of all time, though I don't know if it's quite considered in that same light many more today, is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64. It is a game that I talk about in this episode. And if you've ever played Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, or in this case Super Smash Bros. Brawl, you might be familiar with the in-game masterpieces. So these are essentially demos of games that the characters in Smash Bros. Come from. They were not included they were first introduced in Brawl, and they were not included in Smash for 3DS or Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, just Brawl and Smash for Wii U. And one of the demos included in Super Smash Bros. Brawl was for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And if you know anything about Nintendo 64 games, it's that, generally speaking, this isn't true for every game, but oftentimes Nintendo-developed games would receive release in Japan first, and then it would release to the rest of the world. And that just kind of makes sense. They were getting into text-heavier games. Even something like Super Mario 64, which isn't super text-heavy, still came out in Japan first, just because, well, it was written there. It didn't have to go through any extra localization. And so these were oftentimes the very first versions of these games, right? And the same holds true for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. You would see updated releases with bug fixes when it would be released in North America and Europe and the like, right? And in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, the Ocarina of Time masterpiece in the Japanese version is that original Japanese release, or at least one of the first Japanese releases. And so a speedrunner apparently has managed to beat The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in Brawl, which sounds like, well, that doesn't sound super impressive until you consider that, this is a timed 4-minute demo. And I don't know, in the speedrunning community, it's considered beaten because this is just an any percent. This runner named as Save State, what an appropriate name for a speedrunner, beat The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in 4 minutes and 38 seconds, and beating the game is just considered getting to the credits, which would mean he had 12 seconds to view the credits, which is crazy. So essentially what happened, and this comes, I believe it's a statement from him, is, this Ocarina of Time version is it's a 5-minute demo, so he had 5 minutes to get to the credits, time to do this, and it included a couple of save files, one that was started in Child Link's life, and then one for Adult Link. So essentially what he did is he chose the adult file and just did some of the fancy schmancy glitches you have to do to beat the game. And lo and behold, apparently it appears you can beat The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, the Japanese version, in less than 5 minutes, even in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which is pretty darn impressive, I must say. And I think it's, I think I said this in the Sonic episode. I like my games fast, but I have no talent for speedrunning. So I think it's very impressive to see someone be able to do this and beat a game inside of another game. Even though I wouldn't exactly call it really beaten, but, I'm not a speedrunner. I'm not part of the speedrunning community. They're certainly welcome to define things how they choose to. Similarly, the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time has been in the news because some folks have been working on decompiling the game. So this is like reverse engineering, finding stuff in it to, for example, put it on other platforms. In fact, this the article that I will have linked here by Damian McFerrin mentions that Super Mario 64 was, because it was reverse engineered and decompiled, that it was ported to systems like the Dreamcast and the PS2. So I'd assume the team is going for a similar thing here with Ocarina of Time. But the big reason that you would want to see this ported, of course, is to bring it to PCs, right? Now, I just have my potato of a laptop here that probably wouldn't be able to play anything all that impressive, but we've seen some super impressive modifications to Super Mario 64 thanks to the efforts of this decompiling here, right? There's now a widescreen version of Super Mario 64. There's ray tracing. There's completely brand new models, again, with similar mods that you would see on PC. And, this is just another classic example, and I'm going to be talking about this more with some of these other little articles I have included here in talking about Zelda, of folks or of fans taking the initiative to do things that the developers just for whatever reason won't. And I think that's a pretty clear, important service that fans take care of to assist to keep the community alive around a game, even when it is, in the case of Ocarina of Time, 23 years old, 1998, if I'm remembering correctly. Similarly, you can see things like finding old elements that didn't get included in a game. Like there's a player who found, there's originally supposed to be some poison water as an element in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It didn't end up getting used, though it has been known about for 3 years at this point, 2018, according to the article that I'm reading here about this. But some folks are trying to actually put this back in the game. Now, could it show up in the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild? Possibly. I don't know yet. But again, just another example of fans doing a service to keep the community around The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild going. Although even with the sequel to the game, I do not foresee it stalling anytime soon. Do I have any other Breath of the Wild focused things here? Oh yeah, someone made a map of Breath of the Wild in Google Maps on the Street View, so you can actually just walk around Hyrule in first person. I love these sorts of little stories, especially when, as much as I value things like the mods, there are definitely some legal gray areas in that are questionable, although as far as ethical gray area, or as far as the ethics are concerned, with doing something like creating a mod for Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild, I mean, come on, Nintendo, it's just a modification. It's pretty standard on PC. I totally understand why people want to mod games. Heck, I love fan translations, and that is a clear, classic example of a mod for games that just I can't play in English that I want to play in English. So I think they need to curb their use of that. Although I think there are some exceptions with something like I talked about last year's little Super Smash Bros. Melee Slippy debacle and how silly I thought that was. I think that, that, like I said, there can be exceptions to everything. I want to be consistent here. Generally, I like mods, and I think I think the Slippy mod is genius for people just wanting to play Super Smash Bros. Melee online, but I totally understand Nintendo's apprehension to having a tournament using that. I would not, if I owned Smash Brothers, I probably would not want something like that either, even if I do think it's, ethically okay just for personal use. Of course, over the summer we had the release of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. I still haven't picked it up yet. I've thought about it a couple of times. I do have the Zelda and Loftwing amiibo that was embroiled in a bunch of controversy because it allows you to fast travel between Skyloft and there's a particular term for it in the game, and I'm just going to call it the ground, whatever the land of Hyrule is called at this point in Skyward Sword. But I just wanted it because, like I said, I'm going for a complete collection of the things that I care about, and Zelda is certainly one of those series that I would like to have amiibo for. After all, I care about Zelda. That's kind of why I'm doing this whole episode here, right? But it seems that some folks, particularly in the Dutch territories, are having some issues playing the game. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is a glitch or what exactly the issue is, but it seems that there's no ending cinematic in the Dutch version of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. It just goes to a frozen white screen, which is very, very strange, because apparently if you change the game to English, then you can see the final cinematic and see like the credits after beating the final boss of the game, Demise. So I'm not exactly sure what the team... I'm not sure if this was a Grezzo port like Miitopia was, well, actually they also did Link's Awakening on Switch as well. I'm not sure what the issue apparently is for the Dutch version, but that's something that I would love to see addressed in this, in a patch at some point. But that's just very strange that it's seemingly only affecting one particular language. I'm wondering if there is a glitch with loading the text and the cutscene, but it's pretty upsetting that it comes down to the last version, or the last cutscene of the game, that everything else seems to have been localized. As far as other stories, again, I think it's interesting to see something like this real world. The Olympics was a few weeks, actually it's probably a month ago at this point that the Olympics was, because I'm just, like I said, I'm doing these all on September 5th, these ones that you're seeing in the Rextros arcade shirt. And one of the gold medalists for the uneven bars, Nina Derweil from Belgium, I'm sorry if I pronounced her name incorrectly, but apparently she's had a good luck charm of a Link figure from The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which some people have pointed out that the figure appears to be the Ocarina of Time Link amiibo figure, just popped off of its base. I don't actually know if that's the case, but it looks too uncannily similar to not be that, so... I think it's kind of funny that that is a good luck charm for her, and congratulations to Nina for winning the gold in the uneven bars. At this point right now, we're more focused on the Paralympics, and I'm sure there are exciting things happening there. I'm not much of a sports guy, so I haven't read about anything that's happening in the Paralympics, and I hardly read about anything happening in the Olympics. That just happened to be a nice intersection of the real world and the Legend of Zelda that I thought would be interesting to report on today. So that was just a nice little Zelda-focused roundup of news for this intro. This should be the gold standard for other intros. The Sonic one was a little bit of an outlier because, like I said, there hasn't been much happening, but... that should cover what I wanted to say here today. So why don't I introduce the topics that we're going to be talking about in this Zelda episode. So of course we're going to have our typical, like I said, this is a standard episode. We're going to be talking about an overview of the series. We're going to hear about the futures, though again, this is just a nice little short future talk. And I thought, a lot of these special topics, I'm focusing on just a special question that I thought could be interesting. So I wanted to ask today, what could make the Legend of Zelda CDI games actually be, good and fun and enjoyable to play? Because suffice it to say, they're not exactly considered to be very strong games in the Zelda series. They're not even on the official Zelda timeline, and What a shocker that is, I'm sure. So, with that all said, I'm just going to send you folks back in time to whenever I recorded the original rest of the Zelda bits for this episode. So, as always, please enjoy what you're going to listen to here today. It was a pleasure putting it on then, and it's a pleasure recording this now. Once more, the birthday extravaganza continues, and in this installment, we're going to be doing a long time coming topic, The Legend of Zelda. I don't know how well you can see it, but I am repping the Link hoodless sweatshirt today. It is not hooded, unlike some of the other sweatshirts I've worn on this show. But that, I suppose, isn't really that important. What is important is we're going to be talking Zelda, because this year is the 35th anniversary. It came out in 1986, the original. Not that I want to totally say everything that we're going to be talking about with the original, because I'm going to be doing my overview soon here. But really, what I want to start with in this overview of the series is with some disclaimers, because like the Sonic episode, there's a lot of Zelda games here that I won't be discussing because I haven't played them, and I'm not going to really discuss spin-off games. Like, I'm not going to talk about Link's crossbow training first off, because I actually don't have that game, and I'm not going to talk about Hyrule Warriors. There is one game I'm going to talk about that I think you could argue it's a spin-off, but I think my understanding is that it does fit into the chronology in some way. But I think it's a little bit more up for debate then. But regardless, I want to put out there, what are the games that I have not played, the ones that I don't own. It's interestingly mostly handheld games, despite the fact that I am known for liking handhelds better than consoles, but there are a couple of console games in there as well. The games that we will not be discussing are The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, as well as Oracle of Ages, the Minish Cap on the Game Boy Advance, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks on the DS. I know, a little bit shocking, because I do quite like my DS. We're not going to be talking about Four Swords or Four Swords Adventures. I do have the DSi download version of Four Swords that you can play single player, but I have hardly played that. We're not going to be discussing Twilight Princess, which I'm sure is a disappointment for a good few people, because I've owned the HD version for a while, but I haven't even put it in the Wii U console, unfortunately. We're also not going to be talking about probably the most disappointing one for folks. We're not going to be talking about The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I've talked about many times why I don't have it. I guess I don't know how much in detail I've gone, but suffice to say, there's a lot of the direction that game goes that I'm not a fan of, which explains why I don't have it. I'm not a big open world game player because I get lost too easily, and I feel like it would take way too long to accomplish most of what I'd want to accomplish in it, and in what little I've seen, the game's pretty brutal at the start, as well as I'm just not a fan of crafting mechanics in general. That was one of my concerns with Animal Crossing New Horizons, of course. Folks will remember that from some of the original episodes from this show. But I don't want to turn this into why I don't like Breath of the Wild topic right away. I want to give the overview of what I have played. And one of the things I found is the older we get into these series that we're talking about, I only have one more at this point, but the older we go, the harder it gets to figure out what really is true here, because we're getting into more common knowledge. And when I say that, I just mean there's commonly told stories, commonly told tales about oh, this is the inspiration for this thing in this game series, or this is how it started. But whether they're actually true, I guess I don't really know. Suffice it to say, I would assume most of this is true. I'm sure there are sources and citations for a lot of these that you can actually find. But again, I don't know how much of this is actually fully citable and how much of it is just like urban myth of this is how Zelda came to be. And of course, the common story given for the origins of the Legend of Zelda series is that it was inspired by Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood experiences, where he explored through caves and forests that were near his home. And I mean, what do you do in Zelda? You explore through a whole vast location. Sometimes you go in caves. Of course, then you go into dungeons, which are like caves but more structured. And that sort of inspiration is like, if that's what happened, that's clearly visible because that's exactly what you do. Obviously, there's a bunch of fantasy inspirations for the series. The Master Sword, well, I mean, what is arguably the most famous sword in all of media, the Excalibur of King Arthur times. Of course, it's going to be inspired by something like that. Our princess is named Zelda after Zelda Fitzgerald, just because Miyamoto liked the name Zelda, and Link is clearly modeled on Disney's version of Peter Pan. These are all common stories about how Zelda came to be, and while I don't know how much of this is verifiable, one of these, this last aspect to me seems clearly true, and it's that even though The Legend of Zelda came out a year later in 1986, while Super Mario Bros. Came out in 1985, it's clear that they were being developed at the same time because, The Legend of Zelda is more or less the polar opposite of Super Mario Bros. Mario is all about, we're going to have a linear level-to-level game, and Zelda was complete freedom and exploration in a large interconnected world where you can just get totally lost. And, I haven't played it much, but I feel like this discussion wouldn't be appropriate if I didn't start with the original NES game. And I tell you, I have a love-hate relationship with The Legend of Zelda on NES. It's a game that is significant, and, if you've listened to the Completely Unnecessary podcast, you'll know how Pat on there defends the game to the nth degree as if it's one of the best games of all time. And, I know this will annoy him among so many people, but The Legend of Zelda is super duper outdated. I think one of the most famous moments for me in a review I saw of The Legend of Zelda, some call me Johnny's review, he describes Zelda 1 as a guide game, and I couldn't agree more. And it appears to me that the team at 1987, since that's technically when The Legend of Zelda came out here, 1987 NOA, Nintendo of America, pretty much agreed, because and the reason I say this, it kind of gets to a major reason why I think the game is outdated, because even the original release, at least in North America, came with an admittedly incomplete, but still pretty useful map. So you still, you had this outside source, right? And it also came with a book of strategies, and the instruction manual is pretty detailed. And I guess in fairness, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past also came with some of these. But where I find those additions for A Link to the Past to be kind of like nice bonuses, nice little just helpful hint material, as far as I'm concerned, The Legend of Zelda on NES is unplayable without some kind of outside assistance. And that's just a darn shame, because, all the game really needed were a couple of tweaks to not need that. I don't know if there are any ROM hacks out there that add or change some of these, but just doing a couple of things that later games like A Link to the Past did right would do wonders for improving Zelda 1. Of course, the big one, one of the big ones would probably be showing which areas, or which bushes need to be burned, and which wall areas on the wall can be bombed, because in A Link to the Past, one of the big additions was showing that a bombable wall was a different texture from the rest of the wall that you were looking at. And there would literally be a crack on it if you're in a dungeon, or the dirt would be softer outside. Just doing something like that would go miles toward making the secrets easier to understand in The Legend of Zelda. Probably the big one is having a map. That would go way, 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 way far to improving the game, because otherwise you have to look at this outside piece of paper, or you have to have a guide to figure out where to go. And it's just the fact of the matter is, to me, playing the NES Zelda 1 today is not going to give the same experience that kids in the 80s had, specifically because no digital version of the original Zelda comes with these editions, and it doesn't have those couple of updates that I outlined, among others that I'm sure I will continue thinking of, that would make the game be more user-friendly, right? Not even, like, because Zelda 1 was re-released again a couple of times before the Wii Virtual Console re-release. It was on the bonus disc that you would get with the Wind Waker on GameCube, and there's even a 16-bit remake of it on the Satellaview service on the Super Famicom, but none of those had that outside info to try to make the game make more sense, right? Even today, if you boot up The Legend of Zelda on the Switch Online application, the only map you're going to have is that stupid gray box in the upper left-hand corner. And it, I don't know if just some of these additions weren't, or some of these changes that were added to later Zelda games weren't included in the original because the hardware wasn't powerful enough, or if these newer trappings that I like weren't included because the ideas literally didn't exist. I would assume a map idea, an in-game map, was an idea, or if they're running out of buttons, or just what sort of reason there was to at least to not even include a map. But or maybe they just thought things like these changes weren't necessary. But I really don't want to think that it was the NES wasn't powerful enough, because, Link's Awakening on the Game Boy had a map and the ability to show bombable walls. For sure the DX version did, and I have a hard time believing that the Game Boy Color is that much more powerful than the NES. But, it had those quality of life improvements that just made understanding Zelda so much easier. And it's just a shame, because I want to say that this is an iconic, very important game, but there's just so many strange design choices like those. And then there's other little things like, in A Link to the Past, you have a separate supply of arrows and bombs and rupees. But in Zelda 1, each arrow costs 1 rupee. So every time you shoot an arrow, you use up a rupee. So, instead of, maybe you had a plan of, I'm going to collect this much money to go buy this much stuff, but then you need arrows for whatever reason, and now you need to go back and start farming for rupees again because you used the bow. It's kind of inconvenient. I don't understand why, is there a reason why there couldn't be a separate supply for the arrows? I don't know if that wasn't, again, how much of this just was that there weren't ideas? How much of this was maybe constrained development? I don't know, but it makes it hard for me to call this an iconic game. You'll walk around, and if you can find the proper bush to burn or the proper wall, because like I said, it isn't marked, you can find areas with an old man that will provide you. He'll be like, here's a choice. Do you want a heart container or do you want a potion? And if you don't pick the heart container, you can't go back in the cave or the bush and pick up the other one. So, like, I think players nowadays, no, just don't pick the red potion because that's one fewer heart for you, period. But, like, why is that even presented as an option then? Like, why would you, because you can buy red potions, why would you ever want to just get a heart, or excuse me, just get a potion and forego an additional heart for your health? The game tries to be filled with hints, right? But they're very much written in this early NES translation, as some would describe it, a bit of an English translation. Now, I mean, to be fair, obviously I have not played the original Famicom Disk System version of The Legend of Zelda, so maybe the hints are better in that version because that's the native language. But the English translations definitely leave something to be desired. We're talking about things like Dodongo dislikes smoke, Grumble Grumble, which obviously Grumble Grumble translates to give me food. I mean, I can kind of barely see it, but hardly. God, there's one that I can think of, but I can't think of the whole quote. It's about the East Peninsula, like the East Peninsula holds the secret, or something like that. And it's like, well, what is the East Peninsula that we're talking about here? Here it is. Eastmost Peninsula is the secret. What is he talking about? Supposedly, according to the Zeldapedia, this is the fandom one, so not the an IWA wiki, it is, if this is intended to be the eastmost peninsula, then he's probably referring to an invisible wall leading to the northeastern square in the overworld where Link can find his secret moblin. Just quoting it directly from the page. And I mean, like, I don't know. Is that the secret that they're talking about? The translation, the localization doesn't really make that clear. There's a lot of items that you procure in the original Zelda that I find to be very situational, if you can even get that far. Because, and I say that, I guess let's put a pin on that situational point, but the game is stupidly hard. Like, I remember when I was capturing gameplay, because I was like, I want to have some gameplay to put in over this. And it was just like, I barely made it to the first dungeon because I just kept on dying in the overworld because I didn't know where to go because I just have a big stupid gray box instead of an actual map. And, Link can only stab forward with his sword, whereas in future games, including, I think, future games except for Zelda 2, but Zelda 2 is a weird case. Link swings his sword like anyone who's ever used a sword. Now, again, maybe I'm being super unfair because this is 1986 Famicom NES game development time, but it just seems so strange that the design choice was to have Link stab forward. And, that attack is very ineffectual. You have to be straight in front of an enemy, or straight to the side, or straight behind, and you need to hope that the enemy doesn't turn in such a way where, like, you'll just end up getting hit. And of course, the sword is probably it's like the same size as Link, so you need to just be, like I said, you have to be exactly in front, and that just makes the combat so much harder than it needs to be. And that isn't something, even in the Satellaview remake, that doesn't get fixed. So it must be an intentional design choice, but I don't understand why they thought it should be that way. Because, again, swords you swing with, you'd hardly stab. I mean, sure, you can stab with a sword, but it's not. I don't think that's the way that most people think about using swords. As far as situational items, again, I think of the bait. Where, you might use it out in the overworld to attract enemies, but really the only time you'll probably ever need it is specifically for the Grumble Grumble guy in the one dungeon to get him to get out of your way and allow you to pass through. But other than that, is like, again, using it as a decoy or something for enemies doesn't help a ton, unfortunately. And I don't want to go completely negative on the original Legend of Zelda, but I think there's so many design choices that make it so outdated, and I think it's a shame, because it could be. I think it could still hold up today if it weren't for some of these choices. But as far as like good things about the game for an early NES game, I think it's actually pretty pretty. It's got some very iconic sprites, some that are ugly, like when Link holds up a piece of treasure. That doesn't look super great to me. Of course, it has some pretty classic tunes, the title screen, the overworld, that's still used today. The dungeon music, even if most of these are repetitive, like even Ganon's dungeon, the level 9. I've seen plenty of playthroughs of Zelda. I've just never been able to play it myself successfully. That music is, it's all pretty enjoyable. And then, to be fair, I guess the main reason that The Legend of Zelda is a significant game is just because it really pioneered the idea of open world design years before something truly could be accomplished like that. Thinking of games like Skyrim or, well, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And, I guess one of the things about being a pioneer, whether it's in games or in real pioneering, is that, the first attempt has to make a bunch of mistakes. And The Legend of Zelda certainly has a lot of mistakes. Now, obviously, is it the first top-down open-world adventure game? No. I think that title technically goes to Adventure on the Atari 2600. But still, The Legend of Zelda is a very early adventure game. And, I think that just kind of meant that The Legend of Zelda is going to make some choices that now, 35 years later, are not revolutionary and in some ways kind of hamper the game. And again, it's just a shame, because I want to see the Legend of Zelda in the same way that the kids who grew up in the late 80s saw it. I'm thinking of people like my father. I simply can't have that relationship with it, because I've grown up around the later games, and as far as I'm concerned, they're a lot better. And I hope, like, if there's any classic game that needs a remake, Zelda 1's probably it, because I think it's got so much potential, and clearly it did something for a bunch of people back in the day, but I don't see it. But one game that I don't think people saw much potential back in the day, or even today, is Zelda 2. It is often considered the black sheep in the series, and there's a few good reasons. Obviously, it's a side-scrolling game, whereas most of the other games are either top-down 2D adventure games, or they're 3D adventure games. And outside of the CDI games, which we're going to talk about later, this is the only main series side-scroller. And of course, it's also very, very difficult. And, that's just one of the many reasons why I can't recommend Zelda 2. Now, interestingly, when I was recording, I had a much easier time with Zelda 2 than I had with Zelda 1, but to be fair, I didn't really get very far in any of these games, other than A Link to the Past, because A Link to the Past is great. But, aside from the game just being hard, and I certainly still had trouble in the combat I did play. I made sure to go back to the town and heal up with the lady in the house. That's an iconic moment in gaming. I still was not. I still didn't die. And I think that's important, but I'm sure if I kept on playing, there would be a lot of deaths. And to be fair, it's also on Switch Online, so I can always rewind if I really want to, which I'm sure is, that's cheating, but I'm allowed to, dang it. But I think worse, those aspects on their own, those to me are already not great. But to me, what makes Zelda 2 worse maybe not worse than Zelda 1 in my eyes, but still just not great, is it holds some of the exact same problems I have with the original Zelda. And actually, I guess for this one, the more I think about it, in some ways it makes it worse, because in Zelda 1, you at least had a gray box for a map that had a dot in it that was basically like, you are here. Zelda 2 has no in-game map. So if you need to navigate around the world, you either have to remember where everything is, or you need to have a map. Again, just like Zelda 1. And, the difficulty then not only comes just from that navigation of just needing to go, this is the way that I need to go, especially when you're talking about locations like Death Mountain, that's just more or less a maze. But it also comes from the world itself, because when you're traveling, you will find groups of shadowy enemies appearing, and once one of them touches Link, you enter a battle screen, and Link needs to successfully make his way through this platforming area, and maybe defeat some enemies, if you can, to gain experience points, because that's a very RPG-like element. I guess that's another thing. Folks have questioned whether or not The Legend of Zelda is an RPG. I really don't have an opinion either way. I don't think it's a super important question. But Zelda 2 certainly goes out of its way to incorporate some of those RPG-like mechanics, like experience points, from defeating enemies and obtaining random bags that pop up every now and then that just have the letter P on them. And I think that's a fantastic idea on paper, but the level ups aren't very frequent, and to actually give Link enough power to contend with enemies even in the early game. Because like I said, I was really close to dying multiple times, but I kept going back to, what was it? Was the town Raru, or maybe it was Ruto? Yes, all of the 7 sages in Ocarina of Time are named after the towns in Zelda 2. Although I guess in Zelda 2, with the chronology, it would be backwards, but I digress. But it's just I need more health, I need more magic, I need more at the start to really fairly contend with what I'm up against. And, even when you do get your upgrades, they're not really all that strong in the first place. And it's just a darn shame, because it should be stronger, I should not be having a tough time contending with the enemies at the start of the game and feeling like I'm on the path to dying, but still, obviously there are still some good additions. Of course, this is the first game that actually had a magic meter, and you had spells that you could cast. Later Zelda games, I feel like, actually did not do quite as much with this, but you had to use the magic meter to use certain tools, whether you're talking about I want to say it's the Deku leaf in Wind Waker. You needed the magic for that. It's certainly one of the first sort of RPG upgradey sort of games, because all the upgrades would be done in order. That's pretty innovative, but obviously not quite as innovative as what you have in later games, even something like Dragon Quest XI that lets you pick what upgrades you want with your on the board. I can't think of what the points are called, though, specifically, that you get to choose what goes on the board. But again, these upgrades, they're so infrequent, they're not very strong, that it doesn't feel like you're ever getting a significant boost to Link. And then there are the issues with dying. If you ever do die, Link actually does have multiple lives, as if he were in a Mario game. But, Link not only dies from enemy attacks, but since it's a platformer, now he can fall down pits and instantly die, or fall in lava and instantly die, or fall in water, or whatever else. And, if you just so happen to game over, well, you're going to be booted back to the inner temple that Zelda's sleeping in. And except for if you get to the last temple of the game, where you suddenly get to start there, which doesn't make any sense, because you never got to do that through the rest of the game. So essentially, if you went and did all this adventuring, and you made it through, the maze in Death Mountain, you made it to, whatever temples are all around, you made it across these bridge segments, if you game over, Now you have to do that all again before you can have a second chance at whatever you died on. And that is ridiculous. Again, it's just the Zelda series. It seems to be the series so far, at least just in these first two entries, of strange design choices. But one game, the game that will come along next, that to me just does everything right for the first time, is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And not only do I think this because, it's a Super Nintendo game and I'm nostalgic for the SNES, but there's just so many little improvements that make the game that make the game just more manageable. Of course, A Link to the Past was a return to the 2D top-down sort of Zelda compared to Zelda 2. And, obviously being on a 16-bit console, there were plenty more additions that the team behind the series could do to make the game just that little bit better. Dungeons now had multiple floors, for example. Of course, the game just in general looked way prettier. The music sounded way better than what you could get on the NES. Obviously, I brought up a bunch of the changes that the game made, and talking about Zelda 1 here. Link swings his sword, so you don't have to be exactly in front of an enemy. You have a separate supply of arrows to shoot arrows. You can, when it comes to bombs, you don't just place them down. I mean, you do place them down, but you can pick them up and throw them after the fact. I think the way it works in the 3D games, like Ocarina of Time, works better than the way it worked in A Link to the Past and prior, but I'm getting a little off track there. What else? The world itself had some elevation. The world of Zelda 1 was really super flat. I mean, you had some stairs, but it wasn't obvious that you were actually moving up a layer, whereas in A Link to the Past, you could tell, oh, I'm on a hill here. If I continue walking in front of this cliff here, Link will jump off the cliff. That's pretty neat. Link can swim. Of course, you need to get the Zora flippers to swim, but you can swim. And, go in more places. There are mini games. There are heart containers, or not heart containers, heart pieces. So instead of just getting all of your hearts through dungeons and just getting random heart containers in the world, now you have more quests to do, because you can get a quarter of a heart in the form of a piece of heart, and then once, of course, you get all four, you get a full-blown heart container to expand your health. The hints in the game actually make sense. The big one, there's a map. Thank goodness, a Mode 7 map. Now, like I said, A Link to the Past did still come with a map if you got it on the SNES back in the day. I don't know if the Game Boy Advance version did, but certainly the SNES version did, and I know that because I seriously wish I could find it somewhere, but I know we have the map that came with it. And even still, just having an in-game map not only was helpful, but the locations in general were just way more memorable. There were very few, if any, copy and paste screens in A Link to the Past. Granted, it's been a while, so I can't say a ton as far as like particular locations, like I think it is the Lost Woods in A Link to the Past already, but I can't say for sure that there isn't any copy and pasting going on, but the location still, it's easier to remember where to go, even if you don't have them, even if you didn't have the map. But just having it there makes it that much easier. There's a greater variety of places, in Zelda 1. I mean, and again, I guess I shouldn't be too harsh, because a big part of these upgrades just probably comes from the fact that it was a 1986 NES game that had tons of room for improvement. How would you render a desert on the NES compared to a forest when the whole area looks the same? How would you make caves look different from one another when the technology wasn't quite there yet? You had some of the good things from Zelda 2 come over to A Link to the Past. I didn't even discuss how, I briefly touched on how there were towns, but there's the Kakariko Village on the west side of Hyrule. And I just there's a lot more items in the game. You had your new you had the hammer. Actually, the hammer might have debuted in Zelda 2. I'm not certain. You had like the cane of Somaria. You had medallions that gave you spells. You had the hook shot. The hook shot was a big new item. That's a pretty neat one that lets you just go across gaps if you attach it to something wood. And of course you can kill enemies with it. And I can't pretend like there's no personal nostalgia for me with A Link to the Past. It certainly wasn't a game that I played a ton in my young childhood, but it's one that as I've grown older, I've grown more appreciation for, especially as I've grown some more, but maybe not a ton more patience with slower games. And then a lot of these changes would just transfer, fortunately, very easily into 3D when you got into The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And man, how do I do justice to Ocarina of Time in just a few minutes? I think it's a game that everyone and their mother has talked about for good reason. It was long considered. If it wasn't Final Fantasy VII, it was The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time that was considered the best game of all time. Now, I don't know if I'd quite argue that, but it certainly was a very fun game. It's the only Zelda game, in fact, that I've beaten, and I beat it, of course, on the 3DS version that, did, to be fair, still make some quality of life improvements, even if it was still a pretty good game at base. Of course, the 3DS version looks leagues better than what the N64 could put out, and increased the frame rate by 10 frames per second up to 30 from the 20 that you'd get on the N64. But I don't think there's a ton of innovation in Ocarina of Time to discuss, because a lot of what Ocarina of Time really did was more or less rehash The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, but in 3D. And part of it being in 3D just causes the game to be a lot longer, I find. What would take a couple of... It could take maybe 2 minutes to run across east to west, the Link to the Past map, but it would take multiple minutes to get it to the same location in Ocarina of Time, because the map isn't necessarily bigger, but because you're in 3D, now you move at a different speed than you did in a 2D plane. And, granted, there are some techniques that are supposed to help make Link move faster. I often use the trick where Link would just side jump, because he just side jumps super far to the left and to the right. Of course, later in the game, one of the actually big innovations was actually Link having a horse in the form of Epona. That certainly helps speed things up in the adult portion of the game. But as far as things are considered, like the plot, part of why I didn't talk much about the plot of A Link to the Past is because the plot of Ocarina of Time is almost the same, just switch out a few things. In A Link to the Past, Link goes to save Zelda from, or help Zelda escape from Hyrule Castle. It's under siege by Aghanim's minions, and he brings her to a sanctuary, and then he's told, go find Sahasrara, who will tell you about the 3 pendants to go get the Master Sword. And then Link goes to get the Master Sword, and gets eventually teleported to the Dark World. So now we have a second world, and that's a new introduction for the series. Even though it's really not that different, it's just more or less the same map with a couple of changes. And then he would have to go through and save the 7 maidens that are the daughters of the 7 sages. Or maybe they're the wise men. I can't remember what exactly the name was in A Link to the Past. Until eventually Link would take down Ganon. What do you do in Ocarina of Time? Well, you don't start by saving Zelda, but you save the Great Deku Tree, or try to, who tells you to go find Princess Zelda. And, you don't have to save Zelda, but you find her in her castle, spying on her father, chatting with this guy Ganondorf, who's just the human form of Ganon, because Ganon is a giant pig. And then you're tasked with finding the 3 spiritual stones, which will open up the door in the Temple of Time to the Master Sword. And of course, once you find all 3 spiritual stones, what do you see? Zelda's running away. She's being rescued by Impa, her guardian of the Sheikah tribe. And then you pick up the Master Sword and you open up the second world by going into the future and becoming Adult Link. Whereas for the whole start of the game, you're just Child Link going through these dungeons to get the spiritual stones. Not unlike how you went through 3 dungeons to get the 3 pendants for the Master Sword in Link to the Past. And then you'd go through and save the 7 sages, just like how you've saved the maidens in A Link to the Past, to eventually help them all give you the power to go defeat Ganon in the adult portion of the game. And then, of course, you take down Ganon and live happily ever after. Link goes back to his past and lives out his childhood and hopefully prevents the future that he just lived out, which would make some very strange time paradoxy things, but I digress. But, you know, those 2 stories are almost identical. And I mean, I can't fault the team for making such similar stories, because really the main focus of Ocarina of Time was mostly, let's take Zelda and put it in 3D and see how it works. It just so happened that people really, 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 really liked it. And, you know, like I said, obviously there's still plenty of new things regardless of the 3D. I mean, the 3D is really the big one. You know, there are new types of puzzles that you can accomplish in 3D. There are new ways to attack enemies. There's Z targeting. If you played the 3DS version, it was L targeting, where you would just stay focused on enemies to attack them. Since obviously you didn't need that in the 2D games, you could always keep track of the enemy, since they were all top-down visible. But and you know, there's still plenty of like new locales and new characters and a lot more characters, even if a lot of them are just generic NPCs. But I feel like Ocarina of Time, for as great of a game as it is at the same time kind of a prototypical Zelda game, and I can't fault her for it, because I really like it. I do really genuinely enjoy the base Legend of Zelda formula, and again, that's part of the reason why I'm not super like antsy to try out Breath of the Wild, because it changes so much stuff. But you know, it doesn't do a ton new, but it successfully made the jump to 3D. And honestly, I think I would argue that Ocarina of Time made the jump even better than Super Mario 64 did, even with all of Ocarina of Time's little hiccups, whether you're talking about things like how, like the water temple being very confusing as far as how you raise and lower the water levels, and very tedious because the iron boots are an equipable item instead of, or equipable instead of just being like a permanent thing on you temporarily. Like you have to just go back in and out of the, or excuse me, they're equipable as opposed to an item that you can just toggle on and off, like how you could toggle the arrows or the bombs or whatever you wanted to use in the dungeon at the time. And, you know, I'm trying to think of, like, what are the other major gripes I had with Ocarina of Time? It's been a long while since I played it. I mean, there really weren't a ton, you know, because the game didn't, you know, I'm trying to compare it to Super Mario 64 in my brain, and, like, why do I like Ocarina of Time better than Mario 64, which just the fact that I like a Zelda game better than a Mario game doesn't happen very often in the first place. But I think it's just there's a lot more room to mess up in Ocarina of Time. Whereas Mario 64, you know, you fall down a pit so many times and you're sent back to square one. As far as getting coins, if you're doing a 100 coin star, or your progress on a just a regular schmegular star. Now, Ocarina of Time wouldn't be the only N64 Zelda game. There would also be The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. And honestly, between the two, I almost feel like this is the harder one for me to discuss. Not only because, A, I haven't beat it on the 3DS. If I remember correctly, I'm through the Snowhead Temple. If I'm not through it, I'm playing in it right now with the Goron form. But I feel like Majora's Mask is a tough game to discuss because it seems like it's a very special game to a lot of people. You know, it was kind of it sort of took on another Zelda 2-like role back in 2000, where it's just like, how do you follow up Ocarina of Time? Well, we're not even going to bother trying to top it. We're going to make something we want to make, and people didn't really love it for that. And I feel... I don't feel the special connection that a lot of people have with it. But I can see where they feel that way. Of course, there are plenty of interesting innovations in Majora's Mask, and a lot of things that I like about it that I wouldn't say I love or would love in all Zelda games, but think it's kind of interesting for one game. And of course, thinking about the 3-day time limit and how you have to reset time after a few hours and basically restart. I think that's interesting, but I don't know how much I've talked about. I think I talked about Pikmin a little bit in the N64 and GameCube episode. I despise time limits with a passion. I hate feeling pressured. But I think it's fine for this one game to try something different like that. I actually like how small the world of Termina is. Compared to Hyrule and Ocarina of Time, because it just feels like it's so compressed with things to do everywhere. I think it's interesting that people do things on their own schedule, and you have to be available at a particular day and time to do certain quests. I mean, you know, people talk about, of course, how they like how much darker the game is. I think that's a nice change of pace for Zelda. Certainly, I like Ocarina of Time and how happy-go-lucky it is, ish. There are still the Redeads with the pools of blood in the bottom of the well dungeon. And a bunch of freaky bosses like that. But, you know, Majora's Mask just goes for so much more, a more depressing atmosphere. I like the moon staring down at you like, with its big, freaky-looking, like, expression on its face. I like how... I really like the masks, especially the transformation masks. I really wish that Zelda games played more with character transformations and giving Link different abilities, because I think that was ingenious for Majora's Mask to have, like, human Link and Deku Link and Goron Link and eventually Zora Link. I think those are all brilliant additions. One of the things I actually don't like so much, because the thing that I've found I like about Zelda more in general are the dungeons. But there are only 4, maybe 5 if you include the moon in Majora's Mask. And it's just a shame because, I mean, there's certainly enough to do in the world, but I play Zelda more for the dungeons than I do for the world, and that's just something that I don't love about it. And that's, you know, that's fine. There definitely have to be things about Majora's Mask that I don't like as much. But you know, a lot of these games I find, as far as personal experiences are concerned, because I'm realizing now the more I'm talking, I've hardly talked about a lot of my personal experiences with them. It's hard to have that because I got into the series so late, you know. I remember getting Ocarina of Time in, what was it, 2013? Yeah, no, that sounds right, because I think I got it and A Link Between Worlds for the same holiday. What a Zelda-filled celebration. Or maybe I got Ocarina of Time for my birthday, and I got A Link Between Worlds at Christmas. But it kind of comes back to what I talked about in the 3DS episode back when I recorded that not too long ago. It really comes down to me wanting to broaden my horizons on that system. And I don't love Zelda in the same way I love Mario, but I've enjoyed what I've played. And Majora's Mask is one of those types of games. It was a what? Was it a 2015 release? It was 2015 or 2016. And I never found myself coming back to it, if only because I really wasn't playing a ton of games around that time, for a variety of reasons. A lot of personal reasons. And I think Majora's Mask 3D kind of came at the wrong time for me, because I wasn't, I need to be in the mood to play a Zelda game. And in my experience with the Zelda series, I found myself, when I first started playing them, just like, oh, I'm going to start every Zelda game that I get. And now I've barely touched any, because I'm like, oh my goodness. Now I need to finish A Link Between Worlds, and Majora's Mask, and The Wind Waker, and Skyward Sword, and Link's Awakening, and I have all these started. Granted, I did, pick up Link's Awakening after I picked up Twilight Princess, as well as a couple of others, but I've just found myself in this kind of place where I've a lot of Zelda that I've started, but not a lot of Zelda that I've really made significant progress in. And that holds true for the next two games, because I can hardly talk about them. The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, I've made it through to, oh my goodness, I should know these temples, these dungeon names, but the exact name of this one is blanking in my head right now. It's one of the forest dungeons. I don't think it's called the Forest Temple specifically. Let me double check instead on the NIWA Mario wiki, because I much prefer that wiki to the fandom wikis. It used to be called something else before it was called fandom, but that's not important. Goodness, I need to think. What was it called? I don't think it's the one where you get Makar, because that's later in the game. And I guess that's kind of a thing that I want to point out. I have watched playthroughs of a lot of these games. That's why I know so much about them regardless. But again, I haven't played through a ton. I think the one that I'm the second closest to beating is A Link Between Worlds. I'm probably, out of all of them, the most qualified to talk about that game with Ocarina of Time. But even then, I don't have a ton of memories for it. Again, and I wanna play more of these, but I don't make the time. The Forest Haven. I'm in the Forest Haven dungeon with the Great Deku Tree. That's right. And again, it's just a shame, because I think these games could be pretty good. And the same holds true for Skyward Sword. I have Skyward Sword on Wii. I don't think I even made it to the first dungeon, because the game is just so boring at the start. And I don't know if it's just me, but I found myself having just the darndest time with the controls. Not even, like, the actual sword swinging, but just, like, navigating the menus and figuring out, like, where are all of my items and how do I use them. I found so confusing. I'm sure if I, and granted it was because I was a stupid 11-year-old at the time, or maybe I was 12. It was a few years ago. I was playing a couple of years after Skyward Sword actually came out. I tried it, and I could not get the hang of it, and it really wasn't pulling me in. And again, I think a lot of this is the shame, because I want to like the Zelda series more than I have before. So, and especially now with Skyward Sword HD, I've thought more and more about picking it up, but I haven't done it yet. And granted, the game hasn't even been out for a month, so it's really not a big deal. I don't have to pick it up right now, but I'm like, I kind of want to play more Zelda, and I don't want to have to pick up the Wii U, but I want to play a 3D Zelda, and I don't want to play Wind Waker. I kind of want to play Skyward Sword, since it's like so popular at the moment, but I don't want to start another Zelda game. It's a weird time to be in. But I hope to finish all these at some point. as far as the last few games, Link's Awakening, the only handheld Zelda game I've played, I didn't even play on the Game Boy or the Game Boy Color. I played it on the Switch. So hey, first off, finally more footage here. That'll be great. But Link's Awakening, man, it's a charming game. And I think it is really a game that solidified for me that I really think I prefer 2D Zelda to 3D Zelda. I like the smaller world. I like being able to see all the things that are going on around me. I like, having oh goodness. I already said the smaller map. I like the dungeons are more interesting. They have more unique puzzles, I find, than the 3D games, whereas it's just like sometimes look around for a switch and shoot an arrow at it, which granted, obviously you do in 2D Zelda, but it seems to be a little bit more thought put into it, in my experience. And the same holds true for something like A Link Between Worlds here. I am almost actually complete with that game. I just need to find some more Maya-Mayas and go through the last couple of dungeons and get some more heart pieces and I'll be done with it. But, can't find the 3DS to save my life, the actual one that I have those games with. And again, there's games like Triforce Heroes. That's the one game that I was thinking of that's kind of like a spin-off. That's a 2D Zelda game. I actually found that I really enjoyed it for multiplayer Zelda. I never really thought much about multiplayer Zelda and how fun it could be, but, Triforce Heroes is essentially all dungeons with multiple people, and that's the part of Zelda I like, and why I liked it so much. And I guess that's kind of the pattern I found between A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes and Link's Awakening, is that, yeah, it's a lot of dungeons. And Link's Awakening, even now, you can make dungeons with chamber dungeons. Granted, you have to share them with Amiibo, which is silly, because they should just be online like Super Mario Maker. But, that's more of the Zelda part that I like. And I would way sooner play a Zelda game that has more dungeons than anything else. So, I don't know if this is a particularly satisfying overview of the Zelda series. Again, I feel like I don't have a ton of personal memories with them, and it's an iconic series. It's a series again that I want to like so much more, but I keep finding all these little tiny things in it that just bug me every time I play them, and one day I hope to play these all and have truly better opinions, and that's the thing, I've talked about these for about an hour here, and realistically, if I wanted to, because I think I spent honestly most of my time here talking about Zelda 1, I probably could do retrospective style things where I talk about each one for an hour, because that's just how I am. But I think we should move on and really talk about what's next for Zelda. I don't know. The only thing that I know for sure is obviously we're still waiting on the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And honestly, if I had to give my only real prediction for the Zelda series in the future, the only thing that I know is for certain is I think more Zelda games are going to double down on the changes introduced in Breath of the Wild, for better or worse. And more power to them. That, obviously it's considered a revolutionary Zelda game. It was considered a complete shakeup for the series. It's just not the direction that I really want the series to go in. And that's fine. I think of it interestingly, kind of like with, appropriately enough, it was an episode I talked about here, and it's kind of like with Sonic, This is almost like a new generation of Zelda, a new era of Zelda. And, if Breath of the Wild style Zelda is what's in store for the series in the future, that's fine, but I can just stick with the Zeldas that I think I'll like. I can play A Link to the Past, and it's no worse because Zelda's going complete open world with full-blown crafting and these aspects that I'm not a fan of. I can still play Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask and Wind Waker and still get the Zelda experience that I would want, and still be happy. But I hope that the future of the 3D series is going to keep people happy, even if it is going in a direction that I am not a fan of. Similarly, I guess the direction then for the future that I'm more curious about is there more 2D Zelda in the future? What does 2D Zelda look like in the future? Can 2D Zelda coexist on a home console with 3D Zelda? Because you have to remember, for the most part, 2D Zelda post Ocarina of Time was just relegated to handhelds. Oracle of Seasons and Ages and Link's Awakening, those are all 2D. Minish Cap, 2D. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, 2D. Link Between Worlds, 2D. And what's the connecting line between all of them? They're all on the Game Boy, the Game Boy Color, the Advance, the DS, or the 3DS. Now, with only the Switch, 2D Zelda needs to find a way to coexist or not exist at all. And, obviously I've laid it out here many times. I much prefer 2D Zelda, so I think it would be a crying shame if 2D Zelda were to go away. But I got to see what happens. That's, to me, the future of 2D Zelda is a lot more up in the air, and I'm really curious what happens with it. So, because I would imagine that 2D Zelda is going to hold on to more of those A Link to the Past conventions rather than go full-on open world like Breath of the Wild. So that's kind of what I foresee. As far as like other media, I'm kind of curious as well. I'm not sure. I know like historically there'd been a manga going on for a long, long time, all the way from what was it, Ocarina of Time, maybe A Link to the Past through Twilight Princess. I'd be curious to see if that might make a comeback at all in the future. Obviously, we have the Mario movie coming. I'm wondering, I think, honestly, The Legend of Zelda is much more primed to be a movie, even if Link is a silent protagonist compared to Mario. But that could be very interesting if something like that were to come to pass. What else? As far as other media, I think it would be interesting to see the Zelda series branch out into something beyond just the games. But alas, that just kind of is what it is. So we have one more topic to go over here. One very special topic. One little sub-series of games that I hardly talked about here. The Zelda CDI Trilogy. So if you don't know what the Philips CDI is, I think I talked about it in the SNES episode. Enough to kind of have an idea of what we're talking about here, but it was a home multimedia system that could play video games that had some pretty bad Nintendo games on it. That weren't actually Nintendo games, they were third-party developed, but they basically had the blessing of Nintendo, because what was going to happen was, Nintendo was going to partner with Sony to make the Nintendo PlayStation a device that would be the SNES CD, but that fell through because of money and profits and the companies just not being able to get along. And so instead, Nintendo partnered with Philips in hopes of creating such an add-on that never came to be. Wah, wah, wah. So Philips still ended up making their home multimedia system, but they were allowed to make these games for it. And there were not one, not two, but 3 Zelda games. And 2 of them were more in the style of Zelda 2. So, I guess in starting with this question of how would you make CDI Zelda games good, I would start by not mimicking the most divisive Zelda game. I would not want to mimic Zelda 2 in making my first CD Zelda game on a home console that hardly anybody owned. Of course, you have to think about what sorts of things could have improved the game, not even just thinking about the content. Well, money is the solution to all problems, it seems. If the games, maybe didn't have enough time, maybe they didn't have enough of a budget. I'm looking at this article here on ZeldaUniverse.net on why the CDI Zelda games failed, and they specifically, the first thing they bring up is, yeah, the developers had a year or so to make, or a little over a year to make 2 games, which, I mean, a little over a year it's hard to make 1 game, let alone 2 games, in such a time. So there would certainly be shortcuts that had to be taken. And similarly, the developers, this team Animation Magic, had $600,000 to work with, which granted, $600,000 in 1991, like the article says, is about $1.1 million today. But even a game like, I mean, it straight up says it, a game like E.T. on the Atari cost $22 million to make, which is insane, but I digress. For such a bad game to have cost so much. It's such a simple game at that, but I very much digress. Sometimes it could have just been something as simple as that. I think another big one would be, I'm not sure it was not Animation Magic specifically that did the cutscenes. According to this article, it was a handful of Russian animators that were brought in to do the cutscenes. So, maybe get better animators or better cutscenes and just, in general, better voice acting. Like, there's just so many little nitpicky things that could make the CDI games be that much better. Now, granted, obviously, I think, the CDI Zelda cutscenes are iconic for a reason because they are so bad. So in some ways, I'm kind of partial to them, but it does still make them good. So, and honestly, I guess part of the problem was just the CDI itself. You have to look at something like the controller, one of the controllers looks like a spoon that hardly has a D-pad or enough buttons to do anything on it. How do you play a game with that? Another controller looks like a remote control. Granted, there are some traditional game controller style controllers for the CDI, but even then, not all of the buttons could really be taken advantage of. I think, it's famous that a lot of the actions in Zelda on CDI requires you to press down. If you're standing in front of a door and you want to pull up the menu, you need to press down on the button. But oh no, you're in front of a door and you press down, so you're going to go through the door. Just so use more buttons, or figure out different combinations that might not make the same actions happen with the same buttons. That would be a huge change. Let's see, what else? Oh, of course, the combat itself. Oftentimes Link and Zelda, because to be fair, one of these is Link, the Faces of Evil, and the other one is Zelda, the Wand of Gamelon. You take a lot of damage for a couple of little things, and you just die and die and die and die. Of course, the games themselves don't run very well. They have a very choppy frame rate. If they could improve that would be just one thing that would make the CDI Zelda games that much better. Now, the thing, though, that I'm wondering, I guess, the big thing that still sticks out in my mind as what could potentially improve CDI Zelda is, oh my goodness, I just had the thought and I lost it. Oh my goodness, and I think I saw something in here that got me thinking about it in this article. It would, but oh man, I hate it when I lose my thoughts. I don't know. Maybe I'll think of it later and force myself to talk about it in a future episode. Just write it down. But the CDI Zelda games, they're just such a train wreck. There's something that if it didn't cost an arm and a leg to play them, the way they're meant to be played, I guess, to be fair. I would just be so interested in trying them and just seeing, like, what are they really and truly like. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a lot of the critiques I've seen, and I would rather not just kind of drone on here trying to say nothing than force myself to keep going when I'm just clearly unable to think of what I'm trying to think of. So it's just a shame, because the first CD Zelda game should have been fantastic. And granted, the Wind Waker, what I would consider the true first Zelda game on an optical medium, is, a pretty decent game. But these CDI games, man, they could have been so much more if they just did the obvious thing and mimicked what works. The main 2D Zelda games, rather than mimicking Zelda 2 and doing weird decisions like having to use strange button combinations and having multiple buttons do the same, or multiple actions on the same directions, just oh goodness, wrapped up my cord. Having the terrible full motion videos, even if they are iconic and hilarious because of it. I haven't even thought about, like, the boss battles. The boss battles tend to be like, it's like a weird dichotomy of super hard enemies that kill you in a couple of hits, and bosses that can be taken down in, like, hitting it with one puzzle item. And just being kind of done with it after that. Oh, you have to do a lot of shopping. Rupees are super important. Oh, the level design. The level design could be improved, because there's often times where it's hard to tell what's in the foreground, what's in the background, where hitboxes for platforms are compared to the art. It's such a shame, because these could be, if they were remade, fantastic games. And I guess that's my main question, is because I swear I remember reading a while back that there was someone making, like, a PC port of Link the Faces of Evil just for funsies, but I don't think it's an actually full-blown remake that actually goes ahead and improves things. And I would be so curious to see a lot of these improvements come in, if only because, in a PC version, you could at least play it with a real controller that has a ton of buttons that you can hopefully map, like, oh, here's a menu button. Here's a unique jump button instead of hitting up on the D-pad. That alone would improve the game significantly by having a jump button, because no game should make you jump by pressing up on the D-pad. That's ridiculous. Having separate... Well, I know the sword and the item buttons are separate, but instead of having button combinations, you could just have full-blown buttons, because if I remember correctly, the item use is done by up and the button, up on the D-pad and the button, and it's strange. It's so strange. But alas, I think we have a very, very short one today, but that's okay. We need to have some short ones. I can't always, like I said in my 3DS and Wii episode, I don't always want to do these 2-hour marathons. I think that covers what I want to say for the Zelda series. I hope I covered enough for today, but certainly, like I said, if I'm ever in a Zelda-y mood, or if I'm plowing through a Zelda game, I would be happy to discuss this another time, hopefully with each individual game in more depth, more concrete opinions than what I can just give here, reminiscing on, what were these games like as I played them and haven't played them much in recent memory. But regardless, I think that will close out this podcast. Please, as always, do your typical sorts of engagement-y things on whatever platform you prefer. Maybe you can heart it on Google Podcasts. Maybe you could send in a voice message at anchor.fm/THECOP. I would love to see a voice message there. I still haven't gotten any. I'm waiting. I would love to have likes, subscriptions, all that sort of stuff on the video portion of the podcast. But regardless, I'm happy to see the Zelda series go on for 35 years, see how special it's been to people. I'm hoping the more I play these games, maybe I will figure out why they should be super special to me. And I hope to see it continue on for 35 more. That's right, I want to see the 70th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda on NES. Wouldn't that be a time? So with that, folks, I think that closes up this episode here. Thank you for listening or watching in, and I will see you in one more Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza episode here. Thank you very much.